Kevin Flaherty, Kansas City Sports Network. It's great to be able to say that where he is now. Joins us on 365 Sports. And thanks for your time, Kevin. We just put up that ESPN way too early top 25 with all the teams inside the Big 12 inside the top 10, plus Cincinnati at 22. And what a day for Bill Self. Rylan Griffin commits to KU from Alabama. And then Bill Self and Hunter Dickinson have a little fun on Twitter about whether he's coming back, and he is. How much of an offseason has he had after such an incredibly disappointing season last year?
Yeah, he's had a terrific offseason, and they aren't done yet. You know, I think there are a couple other transfers that Kansas is certainly in play for right now, and even beyond that, you know, Johnny Furphy kept his college eligibility alive, you know, while he tests the NBA draft process, and I'm told that that's not a done deal in terms of him, you know, definitely going to the NBA. And so with all of those things, you know, it's kind of crazy to think about it this way. Bill Self has never not won the Big 12 2 years in a row. Every year that he hasn't won the Big 12, he's bounced back and won it the next year. It's going to be awfully tough to win the Big 12 this upcoming season with how loaded everybody is. And yet at the same time, you know, you get the feeling that Self has Kansas pretty loaded to bear to certainly be in that discussion.
Do you feel like Riley Kugel is going to make it in?
I think that's a major question mark at this point. And I think when you look at that transfer class, you know, the fact that Kansas continues to pursue other wings, I think is pretty indicative. And so I think, you know, Kugel seemed like a really good get at the time. I do think that there were some things that he brought that Kansas didn't have at that time. In particular, everybody talked about the lack of shooting on this year's team. I thought one of the bigger problems, or potentially just as big, was they didn't have anybody to go get their own shot, you know, once Kevin McCullough went down in particular. And so when you looked at Kugel, that was kind of his value. He's a tough shot taker and a tough shot maker, but Kansas has continued to kind of recruit like he's not going to make it in, and they've gotten other guys that kind of have those same abilities. And when you look at how many transfers they have at sort of those 2-3 spots where he would fill in, there's also now a question of, you know, where's the playing time? Because people aren't talking about the two returning freshmen either in terms of Elmarco Jackson kind of playing that off-ball spot. He may play a little bit of point guard as well. And then Jamari McDowell being a 3 too. So you have a lot of guys at those positions, and it's fair to ask that even if Kugel does manage to make it in, you know, how many minutes a game are there really for him to slide into?
How much was the acquisition, and that's what it is, with Jeremy Roach, Duke, headed to Scott Drew and Baylor? I know Scott's lost assistant with Alvin Brooks, of course, is gone. John Jacobs, that's a tough loss to Florida Atlantic. But they're not done. There's the thought about the big kid from Tennessee, among others. How big was that one there, though, with Jeremy Roach?
Well, it's huge, and I'm glad you brought up the coaching, because I think that one of the big things that Roach brings is he's another coach on the court. And he's somebody that has won a lot of games and not just been a part of a winning team, because I think those are different things. You know, you can be a part of a winning team, but not necessarily play the biggest role in them getting there. But I know you remember when Duke made that Final Four run in Coach K's final year. I don't know that they get there without some really clutch play from Jeremy Roach. He's really good in tight games. I think when you look at this Baylor backcourt and the guys they add in that freshman class, and particularly VJ Edgecombe, who's such an explosive talent, having a guy that's a traffic controller out there on the court that Scott Drew can trust implicitly and say, this guy is going to get us into our best looks. He's going to get the ball where it needs to go, whether that's him doing it himself or getting it to other guys. That's just such a great security blanket. And with Jonas Adu, like you said, you know, visiting Baylor, he's got a visit lined up for Arkansas. It's obviously tough to beat John Calipari in any manner of recruitment, but Adu is a guy that Baylor is very much in on. I guess he could take a visit to Alabama, although last time I checked it hasn't been set just yet. But Adu was a guy that this year I'm not sure Tennessee does the best job of feeding their post players. It's not really, kind of what they do, and it really wasn't what they did when they had Dalton Connect going out and getting his own shot. And yet at the same time, there were some games this year where Adu certainly seemed like the best player on the court or sort of right there. And so you think in the right situation, he's somebody that could walk in and be a real star at that center spot.
Kevin, what do you think of, Scott Drew's got to have one of the fastest growing and most impressive coaching trees, I think, going on right now in college basketball. But losing John Jacobs, losing Alvin Brooks now, he's overcome that with Grant McCaslin and others over the years. But what kind of a change do you think that makes, if any, for him and the program moving forward?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I was a big fan of Jerome Tang and still am. And when Tang went to Kansas State, I talked to somebody who was in the coaching industry, and they said, as great as Tang is, they said, watch for Jacobs. Like he's an up and coming star sort of in his own right. And there are some coaches that they can just find those guys, right? Like Nick Saban had a lot of guys kind of come and go, and he always replaced those guys. I'm not saying it's easy. And I think that when you look at, we talked about Kentucky, I think, on one of the recent times that I was on here. I think that was one of the biggest things that killed Calipari was Calipari really struggled to replace the impact that he had from Kenny Payne and from some of his other assistants. He wasn't able to restock that well. The good news is like you said, Scott Drew's been doing this for a while now, and the guys that he's found have really fit in well, and they've continued that trend. I do think there's always a little bit of nervousness. Just, hey, how can the new guy be as good as the guy that just left? But at the same time, I do think that if you were to ask me, hey, who's a coach in college basketball that you would feel pretty good about having to make those hires, it would be Scott Drew. You even look at another guy that's had a lot of success in Bill Self, he's kind of had the same assistant coaches darn near forever. And so it's something that Drew has maybe dealt with to a greater extent than other people, and he's done it in a successful manner.
Kevin, when you look at the rest of the Big 12, Arizona got the Townsend kid from Oakland. Houston
Love that kid. Yeah,
pretty much reloaded. Cincinnati has retained, and who knows where that's going to go. And we haven't even heard about what Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, Kansas State, all the might kind of wind up. I know K-State got Doug McDaniel already. Do you think this is going to be a year where it's going to be another kind of ball of butcher knives through it, and they might have a championship team, or will it look like more like this year where they kind of beat each other up all the way down?
Yeah, I thought you brought up the ESPN thing. I know in Gary Parrish's way too early, the Big 12 has the top 3 teams. So it's, they're going to have guys in that national, or schools, I should say, in that national title discussion all year long. And the funny thing about that one was he had Baylor at number 10. And I thought, man, that could wind up being too low for Baylor, even with 3 Big 12 teams as their 1, 2, and 3. But looking at it too, a team that he didn't have ranked that I thought has had a really nice offseason is West Virginia. When you look at that transfer class and particularly what they've done in the front court, I'm glad you mentioned Cincinnati as a team that's kind of popping up. I think TCU and K-State have both had really nice transfer classes so far, and so it is one of those situations where, you hate to use the whole, any given Saturday or any given weeknight or whatever, but at the same time, I do think the Big 12's depth is going to be at a really high level. I do wonder a little bit, this past year we saw, the teams that were number 13 and 14 were still able to throw a scare into and in some cases beat the very top teams in the league. I don't know that the league will be quite that deep. There may be a little bit more separation, especially when you look at like a BYU, for instance, and losing Pope and then some of the Pac-12 schools that are coming in. But I do think that, say, 1 through 10 or 1 through 11, it's going to be really, really tough to win on a given night.
Kevin, thank you very much, man, and happy for you. When does your podcast begin, or the recruiting show? Tell everyone a little bit about it.
Yeah. So we've actually already started a Kansas podcast, and we've had a few episodes on the Pay Heat podcast. But then we're also looking into starting sort of a local recruiting podcast, and so I'll give you guys more information when that gets there. But it's something I'm really excited about because I've always had, as much as I love college sports and college basketball and everything else, it all starts with the guys that we see in high school. And so it'll be great to be able to tap into that a little bit more.
Congratulations. Glad that worked out. Thank you for your time, Kevin Flaherty, with the Kansas City Sports Network on the Big 12, loading up, and not just the ones